In the dimly lit halls of medieval philosophy, a heated debate raged among some of the greatest minds of the time. The question at hand was nothing less than the nature of Christ's presence in the Eucharist. At stake was the very heart of Christian doctrine, and the answers would challenge the foundations of Aristotelian thought, which had dominated Western philosophy for centuries. Thomas Aquinas and Giles of Rome, two of the most prominent thinkers of the 13th century, grappled with a fundamental problem. How could Christ's body be present on the altar without being physically extended in space? This was a paradox that seemed to defy the laws of nature and the principles of Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher whose works were the cornerstone of medieval intellectual life. Aquinas and Giles proposed that Christ's body could be present in a place per accidens, meaning it could be located in a place through some external means, rather than through its own quantity. This was a clever move, as it allowed them to maintain the idea that Christ's body could be present on the altar without being physically extended there. However, their solution faced a formidable critic in the form of William of Ockham, a philosopher known for his razor-sharp logic and willingness to challenge established ideas. Ockham argued that if immediate presence is a transitive relation, then the quantity of Christ's body would be just as immediately present to the bread as the bread's own substance. This meant that Christ's body would be extended in the place, just as the bread was. Aquinas's and Giles's solution, Ockham contended, was a failure. To address this, Giles of Rome introduced a distinction between quantitative placement and categorial placement. Quantitative placement referred to the arrangement of a body's parts within itself, while categorial placement referred to the body's relationship to a place. This distinction was intended to explain how a body could retain its structure, even if it was only accidentally located in a place. John Duns Scotus, another prominent philosopher, seized on this distinction to argue that God could make a body present in a place without it being extended there. For Scotus, placement relations were external, and God could create a body with quantitative position, but no categorial position, effectively making it present without being extended. Ockham, however, was not convinced. He argued that it was logically impossible for a body with quantitative position to be related to a place, without its parts being related to the parts of that place. This, he claimed, was as impossible as making two white things without them being similar. For Ockham, the reification of accidents treating them as real entities did not solve the problem. Aquinas, Giles, and Scotus all sought to explain how Christ's body could be present on the altar without being extended there, without turning it into a structureless heap. Ockham, however, found their explanations philosophically inadequate. He proposed a simpler solution. Christ's body could be present on the altar through definitive placement, where the whole body is present in the whole place, and each part is present in the whole place. This, according to Ockham, involved multiple location, where many body parts could be in the same place at once. Ockham's solution, while simpler, had its own challenges. It meant that when Christ's body was definitively present on the altar, the structural relationships between its parts were lost. The head would not be closer to the neck than to the feet, and the body would lose its spatial arrangement. However, Ockham argued that the parts would still retain their natural propensities, such as the stomach for digestion and the lungs for breathing, thus maintaining the body's identity. The debate over the Eucharist was not just a philosophical exercise. It was deeply intertwined with the theological understanding of transubstantiation. Aquinas developed the concept of Thomistic transubstantiation, which posited that God could convert the whole being of the bread into the whole being of Christ's body. This involved a transformation of both matter and form, a process that Aristotle's physics could not account for, but that was within the realm of divine power. Giles of Rome subjected Aquinas' theory to philosophical scrutiny, arguing that for the body of Christ to be present on the altar, God must act on the matter itself, not just the form. This meant that the bread's matter would become the matter of Christ's body, and the bread's form would become the form of Christ's body. Giles also addressed the philosophical consequences of Aquinas' doctrine of the unity of substantial forms, concluding that the result of transubstantiation was not a matter-form composite, but only the matter of Christ's body in a quantitative mode. Scotus and Ockham, while accepting the doctrine of transubstantiation, found Aquinas' and Giles's explanations problematic. They proposed that transubstantiation could be understood as a complex of changes, involving the loss of the bread's substance and the gain of Christ's substance. For Scotus, this involved a series of gain and loss changes, where the bread ceased to exist and Christ's body came to exist in its place. Ockham similarly analyzed transubstantiation as a succession of substance to substance, where the bread's substance ceased to exist and Christ's substance came to exist under the bread's accidents. The debate over the nature of accidents and their relationship to substances was also crucial. According to Aristotle, accidents were adverbial, dependent on the substances they modified. However, Aquinas, Giles, and Scotus all reified some accidents, treating them as real entities distinct from substances. Ockham, while rejecting the reification of quantity, reified some qualities. For these philosophers, the reification of accidents was necessary to explain how accidents could exist independently, as required by the doctrine of the Eucharist. In the end, the debate over the Eucharist and transubstantiation pushed the boundaries of medieval philosophy, challenging the limits of Aristotelian thought and exploring the possibilities of divine power. The discussions of Aquinas, Giles, Scotus, and Ockham not only deepened the understanding of Christian doctrine, but also enriched the philosophical landscape of the Middle Ages. In the medieval world, scholars like Aquinas, Giles of Rome, and Scotus grappled with deep philosophical questions about God, nature, and the Eucharist. These thinkers were influenced by Aristotle, who believed that natural things like a tree or a stone are made up of matter and form. They also explored how God could interact with the natural world in ways that defy ordinary understanding, especially in the context of the Eucharist, where bread and wine are transformed into the body and blood of Christ. Aristotle thought that everything in nature has a natural tendency to act in certain ways. For example, a tree grows towards the sun because it has a natural aptitude to do so. However, medieval philosophers believed that God could interfere with these natural tendencies. They argued that God could make a substance behave in ways that go against its natural inclinations. For instance, God could make an accident a non-essential property, like the color of an object exist without a substance, which is normally impossible. The Eucharist posed a unique challenge. According to Christian theology, the bread and wine are transformed into the body and blood of Christ, but the physical properties, accidents of the bread and wine remain. This transformation required a new understanding of how substances and accidents work. Giles of Rome agreed with Aquinas that the accidents can act independently, even when separated from the substance. He suggested that something like lion's semen can act in the power of the lion to produce a lion, even when the semen is separated from the lion. Scotus had a different take. He believed that accidents, while less perfect than substances, can still have causal power. However, they cannot produce new substances on their own. When the bread and wine are transformed, God must intervene to create the new substance. Scotus also argued that the accidents can be corrupted up to a certain point, but the creation of new substances requires God's power. Ockham rejected the idea that only substances can act. He believed that accidents can act as partial causes, but not as total causes. Ockham argued that creatures cannot create new substances from the Eucharistic species, but they can destroy the accidents. He also challenged the idea that extension in place is necessary for causal interaction, suggesting that proximity alone is sufficient. Aristotle believed that for two things to interact causally, they must be extended in the same place. However, the idea that Christ's body is present on the altar, but not extended in place, led Aquinas, Giles of Rome, and Scotus to argue that Christ's body can be located on the altar without being causally exposed. Ockham, however, believed that proximity alone is enough for causal interaction, and that Christ's body can be causally active even if it is not extended. Aquinas and other medieval philosophers believed that the sacraments, like the Eucharist, have a non-accidental connection to spiritual benefits and the real presence of Christ. They argued that this connection is established by God's power, which can act in ways that go beyond the natural abilities of the sacramental elements. For example, the bread and wine, which are natural substances, do not have the power to transform into the body and blood of Christ on their own. God's power is necessary to make this transformation happen. In this way, medieval philosophers sought to explain how the Eucharist and other sacraments could have a profound spiritual effect, even though the physical elements involved are ordinary in nature. Their theories help to bridge the gap between the natural and the supernatural, providing a philosophical foundation for understanding the mysteries of faith. In the world of medieval philosophy, debates about sacramental causality and the nature of the Eucharist were intense and complex. Aquinas, Henry of Ghent, Basilides, and Marinus all grappled with the question of whether sacraments could truly cause grace and the real presence of Christ. They agreed that for something to be a real efficient cause, it must have and exercise the power to produce its effect. However, they differed in their conclusions about whether sacraments could be such causes. Aquinas, in particular, took a unique approach by drawing on cognitive psychology to explain how sacraments could function as instrumental causes. For Aquinas, cognition involves receiving the form of an object without its matter. For example, when you see a red wall, the form of redness without the wall's matter exists in your mind. This concept of intentionalness, intentional existence, allowed Aquinas to argue that material things can receive and transmit forms in a way that doesn't change their own nature. Aquinas applied this idea to sacramental causality. Just as your eyes receive the form of redness from the wall and allow you to see it, the sacraments can receive and transmit the grace and real presence of Christ without changing their own nature. God, the principal cause, uses the sacraments as instruments to produce these effects. This way, the sacraments can be seen as having a causal role without possessing the power to produce grace and real presence on their own. Henry of Ghent, on the other hand, argued that real efficient causal power is in the sacraments because God is present in them. For Henry, God's presence in the sacraments enables them to produce the effects of grace and real presence. This view aligns with the idea that God's power can be present in material things, even if those things don't have the power themselves. Basilides and Marinus, however, were more skeptical. They concluded that sacraments are not real causes of grace and real presence, at least not in the way that natural philosophy defines causality. For them, the sacraments are more like signs that point to the presence of God's power. Scotus offered a different perspective. He focused on the concept of essential dependence, suggesting that the connection between sacraments and grace or real presence is not based on the sacraments having any inherent causal power. Instead, the connection is established by God's structured intentionality. God's will ensures that grace and real presence occur when the sacraments are used, even if the sacraments themselves do not have the power to produce these effects. Ockham, known for his nominalism, was even more cautious. He argued that positing non-obvious essential dependence in nature would lead to skepticism in natural science. Instead, he emphasized that the connection between sacraments and their effects is established by God's will, much like a political ruler establishes laws. For all these thinkers, the Eucharist was a particularly challenging sacrament. Unlike other sacraments, which are perfected in their use, the Eucharist is perfected in the real presence of Christ's body and blood, regardless of whether anyone partakes. The act of eating and drinking the Eucharist is seen as a way to enter into a deeper communion with Christ. However, the idea of literally eating and drinking Christ's body and blood was problematic. Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida, in the 11th century, forced Berenger of Tours to swear that the bread and wine become the real body and blood of Christ, which are literally broken and consumed. This idea, known as ego Berengarius, was deeply troubling to many thinkers. They worried about the biological and theological implications, such as the digestion and excretion of Christ's body, and the possibility of unworthy or non-human consumption. Berenger of Tours, in particular, argued that Christ's glorified body is impassible and cannot be harmed. He maintained that the substance of bread and wine remains, and that the Eucharist is a sign of Christ's presence. He suggested that the bread and wine undergo a change, similar to the Incarnation, where the body of Christ becomes bread impanation. These debates highlight the complex interplay between philosophy, theology, and the practical concerns of the Church. Each thinker sought to balance the need for a coherent philosophical explanation with the theological demands of the sacraments, particularly the Eucharist. Their efforts to integrate these concepts reflect the deep intellectual and spiritual challenges of their time. In the early medieval period, discussions about the nature of the Incarnation and the Eucharist were deeply influenced by the works of philosophers like Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, and William of Ockham. These thinkers built on earlier debates particularly those involving figures like Berengar, to develop more rigorous accounts of how Christ's divine and human natures coexist, and how the Eucharist can be understood as the real presence of Christ's body and blood. The key idea here is that one individual, Jesus Christ, can have two natures, a divine nature and a human nature. The divine nature is essential to Christ's identity. Without it, he would not be God. The human nature, on the other hand, is assumed by Christ contingently, meaning he could exist without it but chose to take it on. This dual nature is crucial for understanding how Christ can be both fully God and fully human. In the context of the Eucharist, this duality is particularly important. The body of Christ, which is essentially human, can perform human actions like eating and walking. However, it can also assume the nature of bread, which is what makes the Eucharist possible. When the bread is consecrated, the body of Christ takes on the bread nature, allowing it to be broken, eaten, and digested. But this does not affect the human nature of Christ's body, which remains intact and impassible. This concept is known as the communicatio idiomatum, which means that the properties of one nature can be attributed to the person Christ, who possesses both natures. For example, it is true to say that God the Son suffered and died, even though suffering and death are characteristics of the human nature, not the divine nature. Similarly, it is true to say that the faithful receive and eat the body of Christ, even though the body that is eaten is the bread nature of Christ's body, not the human nature. One of the main debates in medieval theology was between the theories of impanation and transubstantiation. Impanation suggested that Christ's body could assume the bread nature, making it possible for the body to be broken and eaten. Transubstantiation, on the other hand, proposed that the bread and wine are transformed into the actual body and blood of Christ, but the appearance, the species of bread and wine remains. Transubstantiation became the dominant view, especially after it was endorsed by Pope Innocent III at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. This theory was favored because it explained how Christ's body could be really present on the altar and in the communion of the faithful without being subject to the physical changes that occur during eating and digestion. However, transubstantiation required some philosophical distinctions to make sense of how the body of Christ could be present without being affected by these changes. One of these distinctions is between the sign and the thing signified. In the Eucharist, the bread and wine are the signs, and the body and blood of Christ are the things signified. When the bread and wine are consumed, it is the signs that are physically broken and eaten, not the body and blood of Christ themselves. This allowed the theory to avoid the problem of Christ's body being literally broken and torn. Another important distinction is the different types of eating. Carnal eating occurs when someone consumes the Eucharist without recognizing its true nature, such as a mouse eating the consecrated host. Sacramental eating occurs when someone consumes the Eucharist with the belief that it is the body of Christ, but without the necessary spiritual preparation. Spiritual eating, on the other hand, involves consuming the Eucharist with faith and love for Christ, which unites the person more deeply with the mystical body of Christ, the Church. The philosophical underpinnings of transubstantiation involve the idea that the bread and wine accidents, the taste, color, and texture remain, even though the bread and wine substances are transformed into the body and blood of Christ. This transformation is achieved through the power of God, and the accidents can still be broken and eaten without affecting the substance of Christ's body. Aquinas, Giles of Rome, Scotus, and Ockham all provided different explanations for how the Eucharist works, but they all agreed that the body of Christ is really present in the Eucharist without being subject to physical corruption. Aquinas, for example, argued that the bread accidents can still nourish and be digested because they retain their natural properties through the power of God. Giles of Rome suggested that the transformation involves a natural process, similar to the development of a fetus. Scotus focused on the need for a universal cause, like God, to bring about the transformation. Ockham emphasized that the creation of new flesh in the eater is a direct act of God. These discussions highlight the intricate and deep philosophical and theological debates that shaped medieval Christian thought, particularly regarding the nature of Christ and the Eucharist. The discussion of the Eucharist in medieval theology delves deep into the mystery of how Christ's body is present in the bread and wine. Different theologians, such as Aquinas, Giles of Rome, Scotus, and Ockham, have offered various explanations to address the challenges of this presence, particularly concerning the idea of causal inaccessibility and the potential for the body of Christ to be harmed or changed. Aquinas and Giles of Rome argue that in Aristotelian physics, a body is only causally exposed if it is extended in a place through its own determinate quantity. The body of Christ, however, is not present in the bread in this way. Instead, it is present in the mode of substance, whole to the whole and whole to each part. This means that the body of Christ is not broken when the bread is broken, as it is not present by its own quantity but by its substance. This view allows for the body of Christ to be present wherever the bread accidents are, without being subject to qualitative or substantial change. Scotus builds on Giles of Rome's distinction between quantitative placement, the arrangement of a body's parts to one another, and categorial placement, the arrangement of the body to the place. For Scotus, a body is extended in a place if the whole body has an external relation to the whole of the place, and each part has an external relation to a part of the place. The body of Christ, however, does not have this kind of placement. It is present to the whole place where the bread is, but its parts do not have external relations to the parts of the place. This means that the body of Christ is not extended under the bread, and is thus not exposed to change. Ockham, on the other hand, has a different interpretation of Aristotelian physics. He emphasizes proximity and presence, arguing that the body of Christ is definitively present in the place where the bread is, whole in the whole place and whole in each part of the place. For Ockham, this definitive presence should not be a barrier to causal exposure. He reasons that if the body of Christ is not digested, it is because divine power does not concur with the interaction. Ockham also explains that the body of Christ is not broken when the bread is broken, because all parts of Christ's body are present under each part of the bread, even if the bread is broken into pieces. The question of honor and fittingness also plays a significant role in the discussion. The Eucharist is the ultimate form of worship, and any rite that suggests violence to Christ's body would be counterproductive. This raises concerns about how long and under what conditions the body of Christ remains present in the bread. Hugh of St. Victor, for example, believes that Christ is present corporeally when the bread is eaten and remains so long as the senses are affected by it. Bonaventure, however, argues that the body of Christ remains present only for the sake of human eating. He contends that the body of Christ should not remain present if the bread is consumed by animals, such as mice. The issue of unworthy reception is also crucial. Bonaventure notes that the body of Christ remains present even when received by unshriven mortal sinners, as this is a continuation of the Incarnation. However, unworthy reception is dangerous because it is irreverent and shows contempt. The person who receives while in a state of mortal sin commits another mortal sin. Bonaventure emphasizes the importance of self-examination, confession, and contrition to prepare for the Eucharist and avoid sin. Scotus further explores the perils of sacramental eating when the eater is in a state of mortal sin. He distinguishes between those who are currently committing mortal sin and those who have committed mortal sins in the past. Anyone who receives while committing mortal sin commits another mortal sin. For those who have forgotten past sins despite diligent self-examination, receiving the Eucharist does not sin, and the forgotten sin is remitted. Scotus also discusses the role of the priest in giving communion to unrepentant sinners, emphasizing the need to avoid scandal and the importance of contrition and the intention to confess. Finally, the Church has instituted fasting rules to ensure reverence for the Eucharist. Scotus explains that while the body of Christ is not exposed to causal change during digestion, it would be irreverent to mix the sacrament with ordinary food. The fast of nature, which ensures that nothing is in the stomach, is generally required, but exceptions are made for those who are ill, priests, and in special circumstances. In summary, the medieval theologians grappled with the profound mystery of the Eucharist, seeking to explain how Christ's body is present and how it remains unharmed. Their discussions highlight the importance of both the metaphysical and the ethical dimensions of this central Christian sacrament.